Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Antonia Keaney, and I'm the social history researcher at Blenheim Palace. And you may wonder why I'm here this evening to chat to Ingram Murray about saboteurs, assassins, and subversives. Well, of course, with my Blenheim hat on, we were the headquarters for MI5 during the Second World War from 1940 onwards. And sitting here as I virtually am in Great Court, if I just duck to one side, you'll see that we were also somewhere that 007 visited quite recently. And you can see his Aston Martin roaring through the clock arch at Blenheim. But Ingram, it gives me enormous pleasure to be here with you this evening. And tell me, where are you sitting?
Well, good evening, Antonia.
Good evening.
I'm actually virtually sitting in front of the Subversives Museum in Woodstock, which you can see behind me. And I'm actually in front of a lovely warm fire in my sitting room. With my screen in front of me and my notes and a pile of reference books just to impress everybody when we start talking about the Special Operations Executive.
Okay, well, I think without further ado, and I think again, just to put things into context, the reason that we're here to talk about the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, is because it ties in with a special exhibition that you have at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, which is Spy Oxford or Spy Oxfordshire, and it's lifting the veil of secrecy. So Ingram, without further ado, can you give me a little bit of background on how the SOE came to be and what it is? What was its purpose?
Well, the SOE was a desperate attempt to do something after the debacle of Dunkirk by Winston Churchill.
Right.
And the original idea of an underground organization had been developed by three small bodies, one in the Secret Service, one in the War Office, and one in what was politely called the Foreign Office. And these had studied denial of strategic materials to the Germans by sabotage in what would have been the back areas. Had the original concept of operations in France actually worked. But the Germans, of course, didn't play the game, and they came through Belgium, and there was a complete disaster, and France collapsed.
Right.
These three little organizations were to provide many of the people who subsequently featured in the Special Operations Executive. And the lessons which were incorporated into the SOE had been developed in many cases by these people working in what was called Section D of the Secret Service, MIR in the War Office, and the Political Warfare Executive's predecessor, which was called Electra House. And as a piece of family information, my father was a member of Electra House. Now, the SIS had lost most of its intelligence networks on the continent. They had been wiped out by the German security services, and both SIS and SOE had to start from scratch, building up their resources, their networks on the continent basically from Dunkirk.
So when you say they were wiped out, you mean that the people involved in the operations for them no longer existed. They've been killed or?
Yes, well, yeah. There was a certain amount of poor security, and there were two bad incidents, what's called the Venlo incident, where two SIS officers were captured in a sting, and they gave away a load of information, which they really shouldn't have done. But what was left were people in Sweden, Portugal, and Switzerland who were to play absolutely vital parts in the story.
Okay. Right, so let's move on to our first slide, as it were. And who's this gentleman?
He wasn't really a gentleman. And you don't need a gentleman to head the SOE, really. This is Hugh Dalton. He was a Champagne socialist, a very clever man, a radical thinker, a radical socialist. And he was one of the authors of a paper presented to Churchill after Dunkirk, suggesting the creation of the SOE using the resources that I've just described, the three little organizations that have been studying subversion and sabotage. And he was put into the cabinet by Churchill, partly to balance out the political affiliations within his wartime cabinet. And he was Minister of Economic Warfare. And the Minister of Economic Warfare not only ran SOE, but was also concerned with the strategic denial of materials to Germany. Oil from Romania, ore from Norway, specialist ores from Portugal, and also Portuguese Africa, and also copper ore from Yugoslavia. And they had various plans to do that already. Now, he was a great publicist for his SOE, and he was a believer in basically revolution. He thought that by setting off the working classes, you could overturn a regime. And when you think what had happened in some countries in Europe, there was some justification for this thought. However, the first year of SOE was characterized by two serious cock-ups and very little progress. And Dalton was eventually replaced in 1942 by Lord Selborne. Now, the man in the middle of this picture is the key, the essential man in the story of SOE. You see on the right in the Homburg hat, Dalton.
Right. So
you see this man here, yes.
Yeah.
On the left, in a black hat, is Gladwin Jebb. Gladwin Jebb was the Foreign Office minder who was put into the hierarchy of SOE to make sure they didn't upset the Foreign Office. But Gubbins was a regular soldier. He was a member of one of these little organizations, the MIR in the War Office. He had had to deal with the IRA in his career, and he wrote the manual for the training of SOE.
Right.
And he became eventually what was called CD, who was the head, the executive director of SOE, after being the training and operations officer. And he was a soldier who regularized the processes within SOE, and in the end was responsible for its success.
Ingram, sorry, what does CD stand for? You said that he was the CD. CD,
traditionally the head of the Secret Service is called C, because the original head of it, used to sign his memoranda in green ink, which the CDC still does. And when D section of the SAS was created, the head of that was called CD, and that becomes the head of SOE. Okay. And Goggins becomes CD in 1943. Before that, it was Charles Hambro, and he got sacked by Lord Selborne, and all the directors, the CDs, had a turbulent time, but it was Gubbins who came out on top. Now, these are two memoranda from the Chief of Staff to SOE, which illustrate basically the change from being an underground organization, sabotaging enemy resources and supporting a naval blockade and the strategic bombing of Germany. And this is the original idea. Now, the RAF could hardly find Germany at this stage, and the Navy was shortly to find that German U-boats had to be dealt with before it could operate a strategic blockade on Germany. So both of these other services were very fully occupied. Mm-hmm. And in 1942, when it's perfectly obvious the Germans are going to lose the war one way or the other, the Chiefs of Staff look strategically at SOE and give it this task of interrupting enemy reinforcements to the inevitable invasion of France, interruption of signal communications so that Germans had to use radio, which could be intercepted and used for intelligence purposes, counter-scorch, that's to say prevention of demolitions, ambushes on enemy personnel, and general disorganization in the rear areas. This is the brief for D-Day, basically.
Right. So to create chaos, in other words.
Create chaos, exactly.
Yeah. And we've got a map showing what was happening in France at the time.
Yes. Now, France, of course, was one of the primary objectives of SOE, because that's where we were going to go back into Europe eventually. Mm-hmm. But France was in a state of collapse. French politics between the war had been utterly chaotic. And after Dunkirk, many of the French blamed their defeat on the British, and we were unbelievably unpopular. And France made a deal with the Germans. Marshal Pétain made a deal with the Germans, which split occupied France into two parts. One was the occupied zone in which the Germans ruled the roost, and a free zone under Marshal Pétain at Vichy, which you can see in the middle there.
Yeah.
And there were Italians down bottom right in the Côte d'Azur and so on. But generally speaking, this was a fascist state, and the German penetration during the course of the war got more serious. And in the end, of course, in 1942, the Germans occupied the free zone and it ceased to be free anymore. But for the purposes of SOE, it was a useful area in which you could operate with relative freedom, unlike the occupied zone. But this, you had to have proper papers and so on to get across this frontier. But if you got into the free zone, more or less, you could operate without too much surveillance.
And I think that then brings us on to our next slide, where we start looking at the people involved. So you've kind of outlined what the purpose of the SOE was, but now we actually come to some of the characters, and it makes the story, for me, it makes the story far more real.
These are two very important people here. The lady being given a Medal of Honor is Virginia Hall. Virginia Hall was an American. She was a journalist, and she operated as a journalist, but also as an SOE agent in the Vichy zone. Mm-hmm. And because she was an American citizen, and the Americans retained diplomatic relations with Vichy, she could move about using her American passport. And she was extremely helpful in two major respects, or three major respects. One was, initially, she helped masses of Allied troops escaping from the Dunkirk debacle get down to Marseilles, where they could get on a ship or get over the Spanish frontier and escape. Mm-hmm. She provided an immense amount of information about conditions in France back to SOE, documents, identity documents, ration documents, all those sorts of things that the SOE forgers had to use. And later on, she began providing military intelligence and contacts for incoming agents who were parachuted in or landed by Lysander in the unoccupied zone, so that they could operate efficiently. She was a remarkable woman. She was a redhead. She was very tall, and she had a wooden foot. She chopped one of her feet off in a hunting expedition in Turkey between the wars. So she was very distinctive. Mm-hmm. And the Germans knew all about her, but they never caught her. But she had to do a bunk eventually, and she walked over the Pyrenees with her wooden foot in the winter of 1942. She was a truly remarkable lady. She used a brothel keeper's bank account as her means of distributing cash, and got on extremely well with all classes of French society. She was a remarkable woman. On her right, or on the right of the picture rather, presenting her with the Medal of Honor, is Wild Bill Donovan. And Wild Bill Donovan was an American lawyer. He was a war hero in the First World War, a friend of Roosevelt, and he was commissioned to create the American OSS, Office of Strategic Services, which basically had the role of both the SIS and SOE. And after the Americans joined the war, the whole of the resources of the USA were available, and they created a very powerful OSS, which plays a part in our story.
Ingram, when we spoke before, when you said she had a wooden leg, I smiled. And the reason I was smiling was that you told me what the wooden leg was called. Do you remember?
The leg was called Cuthbert.
It was called Cuthbert, indeed.
Yes. And some silly people back in London didn't know who Cuthbert was. Anyway, she was a remarkable woman, and we refused to send her back because she was well-known and distinctive. So she joined the OSS in the end and was infiltrated back into France with an American group by water, by sea, through Brittany. So she kept going, and later on in her life, she was one of the founder members of the CIA.
So, and she survived the Second World War. Yeah.
Yeah, died in her bed. Yeah.
There is a film that's a couple of years old now called Spy, and Virginia Hall features in it. You know, it's one of these that's based on fact, and yep. I would recommend it. It's such an incredibly moving film, and it's wonderful just to see what some of these women achieved. And I know it wasn't just women, but you know, it really was remarkable. But there's
a very good book about her, which is about 2 years old, called A Woman of No Importance. And I think that film was based on that book.
Right, so that would make sense. Okay, let's move on from Virginia Hall for a moment, and we'll move on to someone who's very familiar to all of us. And I don't mean the gentleman in the kepi on the right of the slide.
Now, I'm sure many of the people watching this will recognize several of the characters in this
Yeah.
picture. On the right of the picture is de Gaulle.
Mhm.
On the left is Churchill dressed as an air marshal. And
Yes.
behind him, an anxious-looking Anthony Eden, who was his foreign secretary.
Yeah.
De Gaulle and Churchill hated each other cordially. De Gaulle was an extremely difficult individual, but he was, for the purposes of resisting the Germans in France, Churchill's best bet at the time. He was a relatively junior brigadier. He'd served briefly in the last French government before that collapsed, and he escaped with some of his officers back to England. And he immediately set up what was to become the Free French.
Mhm.
And he was very insistent on his autonomy, and he was an extremely prickly individual who had to be dealt with, but he was eventually the man who would come out on top in the French model that I've alluded to after the invasion of North Africa in 1942, and we shall probably return to that during the course of the talk. He had his own intelligence service called the BCRA, which was run by a French engineer officer called André de Ravin, who was a very smart operator. And they were supported by SOE with resources, and they operated in concert with SOE and were flown in and flown out, and they had stores dropped to them by SOE. So it was essential for de Gaulle to stay more or less friendly with the British, even though he was very, very prickly and reluctant and insisted on maintaining his autonomy. In my view, he was a great man. As a very small boy, I was introduced to him when he came to supper one night.
Really? How come?
Well, my father was dealing with propaganda.
Right.
He came out of France, and on the 18th of July 1940, he made his famous broadcast through the BBC. France a perdu une bataille, mais France n'a pas perdu la guerre. That was his attitude throughout.
But you know, Ingram, what this picture reminds me of is there's a photograph, you know, going forward to 1965 when Churchill had died, and it was his funeral, and there's a picture of General de Gaulle at the funeral in St. Paul's, looking very cross and very miserable, and it does make me smile to think that Churchill had the last laugh and organised the train to leave from Waterloo to Longhambra.
Yes, yes.
So there we are. But let's leave these two gentlemen here for a moment. And you mentioned the word Lysander, and we've touched very, very briefly on one of the agents, and you mentioned things being dropped or parachuted in. So what role did this quite spooky looking plane have in the events?
Well, air transport was one of the key elements of the success of the SOE. And the SOE relied on what were called the special duty squadrons. And there were several of these, but the two principal ones in England were 161 and 138.
Right.
And 161 flew this black Lysander into and out of France, taking mail, agents, equipment, and so on to the resistance, and bringing out agents and letters and so on and so forth.
Ingram, you say mail agents. Why was it only mail agents?
Oh no, it was mail. I was talking about letters.
Oh, as in the post.
Oh, they're female agents and children in one
I was going to say, how bizarre. So sorry, I beg your pardon.
children.
So
Anyway, the Lysander was pretty useless at everything else,
yeah.
except night operations flown by very expert pilots.
Mm-hmm.
It was designed to land in a field. You can see a massive undercarriage underneath it. And the cylindrical object underneath it is a tank carrying an extra 150 gallons of petrol, which meant that its range was about 500 miles. It could go 1,000 miles. So out and back, it could get quite far into France. And it would land in a field. There would be people there with torches laying out a very short landing strip. It would land very smartly, turn around, and the people inside would hop out. They'd chuck out the bags of mail and the radios and all the rest of it they were bringing. And then the people who were picking up would hop back in. There's a little ladder on the other side, and off they'd fly. Right. And they flew by eye, very, very low, and they found their way entirely by map reading and following the features on the ground. And they were an extremely expert lot. And they were based at a place called Tempsford in Bedfordshire, but they used to fly from near Chichester, from Tangmere. And the two special duty squadrons at Tempsford during the war delivered 1,100 agents, wow. Which is not bad going. And they also dropped 29,000 containers and 10,000 packages during the course of the war. And that's just the Tempsford lot.
Goodness me. And we'll see some of the things that they dropped, some of the items, but in the meantime.
Now this photograph emphasizes the importance of parachuting. At the beginning of the war, the British developed a safe parachute and safe parachuting drills. And many's the time I've parachuted with a parachute like that, which is called the X type. And this is a picture of a Jedburgh team, which is embarking in a black American special duties plane, a Liberator. The two squadrons of black Liberators in Britain were called the Carpetbagger Squadrons. Right. And they were used, as well as the British, to drop agents into occupied Europe. And the lady with the handbag is a Fanny conducting officer for the Jedburgh team. And the Jedburgh teams were in threes, and they were dropped with a standard package of 10 containers into the middle of France. But the techniques developed at Ringway, which is now Manchester, it's now the Manchester Airport, was safe shore, easy to learn, and efficient. And as a result, we were able to drop hundreds of people into occupied Europe and, of course, into occupied Asia during the course of the war. It was the means of getting stores and people to SOE in occupied Europe.
Gosh. And they didn't always do these drops under the cover of darkness, I believe. Is that right?
Well, normally it was under cover of darkness, but later on, when the Luftwaffe was pretty well demolished and had withdrawn, they would drop by day. And there's a lovely picture there of a daylight drop. That's the Glaire Plateau in southeastern France. And by that time, we were dropping during daylight to the Maquis in France. And on the 14th of July, 1944, the 8th US Air Force, as an act of defiance, mounted Operation Cadillac and flew at low level right across France, dropping containers all over the shop to stick it on the Nazis as a demonstration of support for the resistance. And it was a marvelous show.
And were they, I mean, did many aircraft get lost during these daylight drops, or, you know, was luck on their side?
Oh, generally speaking, luck on their side.
Yeah.
I've got some figures here, actually, which I can quote. For F section, that is to say, just the British section dealing with France, F section, there were 3,733 parachute drops, 5,000 tons of stores, weapons dropped off, 470 agents, 81 Lysander pickup operations. We've seen the Black Lysander already. And something like 307,000 kilograms of explosives for sabotage purposes, and 104,536 Sten guns. And we'll come to the Sten in a minute.
Ingram, over what period of time, those figures, were they over a month, a year, 2 years?
That's 1942 to 45.
Okay, so a 3 year
not
period.
very really seriously in 1942.
Okay. Okay, now you've mentioned some of the items that they would drop, and I love this photograph. Can you explain what is this?
This is the standard C-type container. This is the example which we have in the museum in Woodstock. It's a very simple sheet steel box, cylindrical box. It's a 6-man load. It has handles down the side, and you would pack into it weapons, explosives, ammunition, radios, and so on. You can see there's a buffer at the top on its nose where it landed.
Oh, and right, yeah.
You can see its parachute on the right. And a bomber could carry, depending on the type, 10 to 14 of these underslung in its bomb bay and drop them out, just as we saw in that photograph just now. And they were packed in special packing stations. The Americans set one up, and we had one at Audi End. And thousands and thousands of these were packed to standard order. So you knew what you were getting in each one. You had a Bren gun and so many magazines and ammunition and so on and so forth. So they became standard kits. And this was an extremely efficient piece of equipment, and thousands of them were manufactured and dropped. So come along and see it in the museum.
And again, we're going to look at some of the other items from the exhibition, which I find absolutely fascinating. But we're going to move on to a little bit of sabotage. And again, this car.
This is assassination rather than sabotage.
Okay.
This is assassination. And this is probably the biggest, the most celebrated assassination by SOE or by Czech agents trained by SOE during the war. This is the assassination in Prague of Reinhard Heydrich, who was an absolutely super Nazi. He was a Reichsprotektor of Bohemia, and he was a very, very nasty piece of work. And the Czechs, trained by us, decided to do him in. And the RAF parachuted 2 teams in. They had to do it by night in the winter because it had to be done during the dark, and only the winter nights were long enough for this to be done. Anyway, they ambushed his car, they threw a grenade at it, he died of blood poisoning, and then there was the most appalling retribution. The Germans took 2 villages apart, they shot all the men, they killed 39 children in the village of Lidice, which is one of the villages which is remembered, and sent all the women into concentration camps where most of them were worked to death. It was a terrible retribution for this very significant act of assassination.
Which country? Was this in France?
No, Prague.
In Prague, right, okay.
Prague. He was a protector of Bohemia.
Okay.
So they had to get a long way into Europe before they could actually get at him. The operation was called Operation Amphipoid, and there was a film about it on television about 3 or 4 years ago. And if you go to the little church where the assassins ended up, it's a little shrine now. And when I last went there, the British Defence Attaché put a posy of flowers there every day in memory.
When you said about the retribution, which was truly horrendous, was it worth it to kill off this one man? Was he such a powerful, or such an important part of the Nazi regime that he merited this kind of loss of life?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there was an SOE scheme later on to assassinate Hitler, of course, but I think it came to 2 conclusions. One was it was better to leave him there because he was so stupid, and secondly, he was so well guarded that the prospects of doing so were extremely limited.
Okay.
But it put the wind up the Nazis.
I bet it did. I bet it did. Ingram, looking at this next slide, tell me about this.
Well, this comes out of the SOE manual. It also comes out of the IRA manual, if you could put it like that. And it comes out of pretty well every terrorist organization's manual that there is. And it was exercised in France a lot by the resistance, and of the resistance of the communists were undoubtedly the most ruthless when it came to assassination. They believed that if you assassinated a German soldier, the resulting retribution turned the population against the occupiers. And in Paris and elsewhere in the Atlantic ports, the communists were assassinating German officers. And the assassin in the case of the first chap in Paris is commemorated in one of the Paris metro stations. But assassination was one of the weapons employed by SOE, it raises some very complicated moral issues that perhaps we could touch on at the end.
Okay.
SOE operated an operation called Rat Week in early 1944, where it commissioned the resistance to bump off as many Gestapo people as they could do. And they hired the Marseilles mafia to bump off as many Gestapo and French fascists as they could find in the area of Marseilles. And this is supposed to be organized by Hardy Ames, who we know in another context.
Absolutely. So he went on to design dresses for the Queen.
He did indeed.
Yes, my goodness. We've looked at the assassination a moment ago, or one of several, I'm sure. And let's move on to a more subtle approach, as it were. And tell me about this young man.
This young man is Harry Ray. Harry Ray was a saboteur par excellence. He starts the war as a pacifist. He's a school teacher. He is of Jewish heritage. So he decides, when he learns what the Germans are doing to the Jews, to join SOE. And he speaks perfect French. He is parachuted in, and he decides to go to Monsieur Peugeot, who runs a Peugeot factory making tank parts for the Germans, the place called Sochaux, and say to Mr. Peugeot, look, monsieur, the RAF are going to bomb your factory one day. And given the standards of accuracy of the RFA, the RAF, they'll flatten half the town. If you don't want that to happen, let me in through the back door one night and I'll blow up the key machinery in your plant, and that will stop it, and it will save lots of French lives. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Peugeot, perhaps not surprisingly, agreed. And Harry Ray and some of his associates got in through the back door, put plastic explosive on the key machinery in this factory, and it was out of action for the rest of the war, bloodlessly. Perfect. Which is a remarkable feat. Yeah. Later on, he had an incredible adventure where he was arrested by a French policeman, or German policeman actually, working with the French, and they had a stand-up fight, and he got shot 4 times through the body. To get away, he swam a river, and he eventually got into Switzerland, where he was put into hospital and the bullet holes repaired. A remarkable man. At the end of the war, he went back to schoolmastering and became the headmaster of Watford Grammar School, and then a professor of English at York University. He was DSO, OBE, and I should think so too.
Okay, so his form of sabotage was actually quite subtle, as I say, and a little bit understated. But I think if you look at this next photograph, this is not so subtle.
Not quite so subtle at all. No. The Germans depended on the railways for practically everything: strategic materials, moving their troops, moving their prisoners, moving their slaves, moving their tanks, and so on. And before D-Day, and indeed during 1942 and 43, rail sabotage was one of the most serious ways of holding up and interfering with German communications. And when it came to D-Day, SOE developed a series of what were called color plans, red, green, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. One of which was rail sabotage to prevent the German divisions spread throughout France from reinforcing the defenses on the Normandy coastline. And this was done incredibly efficiently by the resistance, led by SOE, who dropped masses of plastic explosive to them, and was extremely successful. But as a subtle form of rail sabotage, there was one amazing story. A SOE agent called Tony Brooks got 2 12-year-old girls to exchange the oil in the axle boxes of tank carrying wagons for an abrasive oil provided by SOE, so that the axle boxes ran hot when the train moved. So the train had to stop, tanks had to be unloaded, and they had to go to Normandy on their tracks, which was a serious impediment to the movement of the French armored divisions from the south of France. So that's another form of subtle.
Very subtle. Very very subtle. And again, let's look at this one. So it wasn't just railways. What's happening here? This is not subtle.
No, this is another very serious and famous act of sabotage, and this is in the Balkans. Now, this is the Operation Harling, and this is the Gorgopatamos viaduct on the Salonika to Athens railway. And this was blown up by a team headed by a sapper officer called Eddie Myers, who parachuted in with a number of sappers, a load of explosives, and joined up with the Greek partisans to cut this line just about the time of Alamein to prevent the Germans reinforcing the Africa Corps through the port of Piraeus. It's quite a story, and it illustrates one of the strategic purposes of SOE, which was to keep us, not only to deny the Germans routes by which they reinforce their forces, but also to keep as many German forces in the Balkans as possible by bothering them and denying them strategic materials like copper and oil and so on and so forth. And it was for these reasons that the British in 1943 changed sides with the resistance in Yugoslavia and started to back Tito. And Tito and his partisans were much more serious opponents of the Nazis than the former Yugoslav army under Mikhailovich were. And the British parachuted in sapper teams like this one to blow up the railways in Yugoslavia as well, which they did extremely efficiently. And they were successful engaging and keeping large numbers of German troops in Yugoslavia to keep down the partisans. So this was another serious coup when it came to strategic sabotage.
And you mentioned groups or teams of agents or soldiers, etc. And this particular group were pretty effective as well, weren't they?
This is Grouse.
Yes.
This is Grouse. This is the team of Norwegians who blew up the Norsk Hydro works, which were making heavy water for the German experiments with atomic weapons. They were part of something called the Linger Company, which was a Norwegian company training in Aviemore in Scotland. They were specially selected and they were parachuted into Norway. They survived the winter on the Hardanger Plateau, eating reindeer moss and reindeer as well. And on their skis, with their equipment, they skied over to the Norsk Hydro plant, got in through the back door and blew up the plant. And here is the plant. You can see it's a hydroelectric plant, and the Grouse team got into the gorge down below to the right, and then clambered up the rocks, got in, as I said, through the back door, and without hurting anybody, they blew up the vital installations in the plant, which was making heavy water. And the residual heavy water, which was already in tank cars on its way to Germany, was sunk by another team of saboteurs in a ferry crossing the fjord a bit later on. And this is probably the most famous act of sabotage during the war, Operation Gunnerside, by the Norwegian team. And they survived. They skied into Sweden and were flown back to England and were given suitable rewards and decorations. it was an amazing piece of work, and they were amazingly tough people.
Well, I think to actually, clamber up the side of this enormous group, because I don't think you quite get the scale of how high this is in the mountains. I mean, it was an incredible thing.
Absolutely. Any winter too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that is sabotage writ large.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's have a look at this young man, and this is a splendid piece of kit that he's got on his very hands.
The SOE, and indeed all the secret organizations we developed during the war, depended on radio for their communications. And the radio service of the SOE and the SIS were absolutely central. And this is an SOE operator in the field in Yugoslavia. The set he has got is called the B2. It's probably the most celebrated shortwave set of the war. It was very heavy. It was about 32 pounds and looked pretty distinctive in its briefcase. And it was developed into something later on, which was called a JED set. And you'll see a picture of that in a minute. Mm-hmm. And you could transmit over 500 or 600 miles of that using Morse, of course. And all your messages would have been in cipher. And this chap is probably listening to an incoming call and writing it down in a set of jumbled letters, which later on he will decrypt using a special cipher. And ciphers became more and more important during the course of the war as the German intelligence and listening services became more and more efficient. Now, the B2 set was very versatile. You could see, because there were no mains electricity in Yugoslavia, he's got a battery there, which is connected to operate it. But it was a very versatile set. You could actually plug it into the mains if you had the right sort of mains and the right sort of plug. Mm-hmm. So it was an extremely useful piece of equipment.
Okay, so that's him in the field, and he's receiving a message or whatever. And then how do these women fit in?
Well, this is a very famous picture of the Fannies operating Special Station 53A, which is Grendon Underwood in Buckinghamshire, now a prison. And this is the base station in Grendon Underwood. And all these girls of the first aid nursing yeomanry are listening to individual circuits on which agents in continental Europe will be working. And the chap we just last seen would have been transmitting back to Cairo, where there was another station in Algiers, there was one in Calcutta, and they had radio stations, the SOE, all over the place. Mm-hmm. And they were all manned, if that's the right verb, by the girls of the first aid nursing yeomanry.
Right.
And the SOE took over its own communications from SIS on the 1st of June 1942. The service was run by an extremely efficient officer called Nick Nichols, who, realizing there weren't enough men about to man his signal service, decided to recruit women. And he went to two amazing Fanny sisters who'd been ambulance drivers during the war, First World War, that is, and said, can you recruit girls, intelligent girls, for me to be actors, cipher operators and radio operators? And altogether, they recruited about 3,000 girls who manned these radio stations in Buckinghamshire, in Cairo, Italy, Algiers, and so on. And being very young, they were easily trained. They had to have a very high standard of Morse. And I've interviewed 3 of them, and they were absolutely delighted. They were very young. They went straight from the 6th form at school. They were away from their mothers, of course, which was a benefit. And they were dealing with an extremely serious secret business during the war. So it was really something important to them. And they were also exceedingly good looking, many of them.
Ingram, were they, I've spoken, like your good self, I've been really fortunate to be able to track down some of the MI5 ladies who were based at Blenheim. And they all said they were recruited by word of mouth, really. And, you know, it was through someone who knew their parents or whatever. And was it the same for these girls?
Yes, I mean, they tended to come from the posh schools. Like, I mean, two of the ones I interviewed came from Cheltenham. Mm-hmm. They were not told what they were doing until they were literally introduced to it. They were trained at Fawley Court, which is now Henley, which was a special school for them. Yeah. And if they didn't match up, they got chucked out pretty quickly. And of course, some of them were at Tame Park, which is where the agents were trained, and some of the agents themselves were fannies. And we'll come to one of those in a minute.
Okay, and you mentioned that they had to be pretty damn good at Morse code, et cetera, et cetera. And I believe there were all sorts of security checks built into the code so that, you know, agents in the field would know that they were dealing with the real thing, et cetera. But sometimes it went horribly wrong.
Well, three security measures. One was the ciphers themselves, which were vastly improved throughout the war. And a man called Marx, who was the SOE cipher officer, developed those, and he came up with what are called one-time pads, which are or were pretty uncrackable. Mm-hmm. Secondly, agents had certain security checks, which if they left them out, indicated they were under duress.
Okay.
And thirdly, there were what called signal plans, which meant that you transmitted on different frequencies, different days, and in different ways, so that the monitoring services of the German intelligence services had great difficulty in tracking down who was who and who was where. However, this did not always work. And this is a famous episode of which this plaque is a commemoration. In 1942, the Dutch section of SOE ignored the fact that one of their operators in Holland was omitting his security checks. And there were several episodes like that. Indeed, one, the base station was ordered to say, "You've forgotten your security checks," which is a very stupid thing to do, really. Yeah. Anyway, as a result of this Englandspiel, as the Germans called it, 52 agents, Dutch agents, SOE and SIS, fell into German hands. The Germans ran the Dutch SOE operation for 2 years. And they took in all the stores, all the radios, all the agents the moment they landed. And as a bonus, they shot down several planes on the way home because, of course, they delivered their goods and they just had a night fighter up there waiting for them to turn back, head to England. And in the end, this created a serious crisis within SOE. The head of SIS, Minges, took advantage of Churchill's absence in the Middle East and proposed to Attlee the dissolution of SOE. At the same time, Harris, by that time in charge of Bomber Command, said he wasn't going to fly any more missions for SOE. And there was a big crisis. And Gubbins writes a paper. Churchill comes back. He presents the paper to Churchill and says, "Look, D-Day is coming. You've got to back the SOE because we've got all these plans to cut railways and so on and so forth." Churchill banged heads together. He said to Harris, "You've got to produce 2 extra transport squadrons to fly these people in." He told Minges to back off, and he backed SOE's efforts on D-Day. But however, this was one of the major sacrifices made by SOE for very poor security to an extremely efficient German Hirschdienst, as it was called, the listening service.
Gosh, very sobering, very
Very
sobering.
sobering, yeah.
Yeah. And
now, this is the story of the message personnel. And here are people in the French service giving the news in French to France. And at the end of the news, they would send out a whole series of incomprehensible sentences and sayings, which only two people would know. One would be the person who sent it, and the other is the person who received it. The person listening, a German, would not know what it meant. Mm-hmm. But this was a way of triggering action by SOE, and it became a famous process, and it was used not only in France, but all over the SOE world. And for most people, the most memorable of these messages is the one in the film The Longest Day, when the Germans intercept the lines of Verlaine, les sanglots longs des violons d'automne blessent mon cœur avec un son monotone, which said, right, chaps, this is the time to start blowing up the railways. And it was an extremely efficient service. It was also the time that the BBC came of age, because of its broadcasts to the continent were extremely important in keeping morale up. And for this purpose, the next slide tells us that we dropped thousands of these, what were called biscuit tin receiver sets, into occupied Europe, which enabled not only the resistance, but also French citizens to listen to the BBC broadcasts, and also SOE broadcasts and SIS broadcasts, by using the different frequency crystals you can see at the bottom. Mm-hmm. Very robust, very simple, very efficient. The biscuit tin receiver. And here we have a lovely picture of a French SAS patrol. They couldn't be more French. The one with the flag in particular, with, if you can see on the ground, the biscuit tin receiver, which the chap is listening to.
Down here.
And behind that is the JED set, the B2, which was turned into put into a metal container. And you see the chap with his right hand is tapping the Morse. Mm-hmm. The other one's holding the aerial. And the one with the fag is grinding the generator, which provides the current to the JED set. And they'll be working back to Britain. And that's a perfect example of the way that these teams after D-Day were working in the field.
And there's, again, going back to working in the field, you know, this is not radios this time, but again, it's a fantastic photograph.
This is a very famous photograph of an instructor teaching maquisards about the stem gun. And as I said earlier on, the British manufactured and dropped absolutely thousands of this very simple weapon into France. It's pretty lethal, but it was simple, very cheap. It fired ammunition, of which there was great stocks and the same caliber as the German submachine guns. And the Maquis were young men, and in some cases you can see old men, who were escaping the French, what was called the service de travail obligatoire, which was forced labor in Germany, which was introduced by the Vichy government, or by that time, the German government in France was taken over the free zone, and introduced legislation where young men had to go to France as, quotes, volunteers to work in German industry. So what did they do? They do a bunk and get into the hills and form perfect examples of a secret army, which retrained, fed, and armed. And this is a perfect example of an instructor. He's a Frenchman, and young and old learning how to use the stem. One of the most fascinating stories, which we don't have time for tonight, is how the SOE got enough money, French money, gold, to finance a massive operation of this sort. They bought it on the black market, but that's for another night, perhaps.
I think I can sense a part 2 coming up, Ingram. But this, I mean, again, you've been very patient with me over the last few weeks, and you've explained a lot to me. And you pointed out that this, and I keep getting the pronunciation wrong, the Jedburghs, is that right?
Jedburgh.
There we are again. Anyway, this group, there is one Brit, and I think it's so easy to spot which one he is. But tell me about this wonderful group of young men.
Well, when D-Day happened, the RAF and the USAF rained agents, saboteurs, and teams into occupied France to stir up trouble. And we've seen some of the trouble that they stirred up. But among these teams were what were called the Jedburghs. And these were inter-allied teams of a Frenchman, an Englishman, and an American. And you wouldn't mistake any of these in this particular picture. The one in the middle is the radio operator. He's an American, obviously. And they were trained by the British at Milton Hall near Peterborough, and about 100 teams were dropped in at D-Day, both from Britain and from Algeria, to marshal the Maquis, provide it with military orders and to some extent a military status, in order that it shouldn't go off in its own direction. So it was a means by which the Allies controlled the resistance operations after D-Day. On the whole, they were very successful, and they were used later on in Burma. We had a family friend who was one, who was dropped into Eastern France, and then later on in Birmingham, into Burma. And he had a fairly hairy time, but he thought he'd done an extremely good job, even though the circumstances in Eastern France were chaotic, with the German withdrawal and so on. But to provide a structure to the Maquis, to guide it, to supply it, and to give it a status as a military force.
Ingram, I think again, before I spoke to you concerning this project, I had no idea that there were so many different nationalities involved in the SOE, and also quite a number of political allegiances. And again, this is quite some photograph, isn't it?
Yes, this is a photograph of French communist partisans, the FTP. And you can see they are armed by the British. Most of them have Sten guns. One's got a Bren in the corner there. And the communists, once the Germans had invaded Russia, turned on the Germans throughout Europe and became some of the most efficient and ruthless resistors. But the problem that SOE had, even though its individual operators on the ground didn't really care who the hell they were supporting, providing they cut German throats, the objective of most of the partisans was a communist takeover at the end of the war. And this applied in France, where it was rebuffed, partly because de Gaulle got his own people parachuted in to take over the local government. It failed in Italy because we basically backed the non-communist partisans, but we also backed some of the communist ones to give it a sort of even Stevens. And of course, in Yugoslavia, we basically handed the job to Tito and his partisans. So it was an extremely important political issue throughout the story of SOE. And that's one of the reasons why the Foreign Office was so nervous of what the SOE were up to every time. Mm-hmm. And it was also one reason why de Gaulle was so suspicious of SOE, because it saw SOE supporting his political opponents in France. And they were a very considerable problem for SOE in the broader political sense. But on the ground, they were great. And they were supplied, as you can see, with massive amounts of weapons and conducted serious sabotage, and were, when it came to assassination, quite ruthless.
Well, I think I'm kind of conscious of the time, and I find the next slide actually quite disturbing. And these acts of sabotage, etc., weren't without consequence. And again, Ingram, tell us what's happening here. It's quite self-evident.
This is a resistant being shot by a firing squad, probably in the Fort Valérien, which was where the execution ground was north of Paris. The German security services were extremely efficient. Mm-hmm. About a quarter of the agents we sent in did not survive, and masses of resistants were caught, not only by the Germans, but also by a very nasty body of people called the milice, who were fascist militia created by Darno in late 1943, and who, because they spoke French and were local Frenchmen, could tell if they were talking to a foreigner. And they also infiltrated the resistance and arrested a whole lot of people. And in many cases also, the Germans mounted anti-resistance operations, anti-Maquis operations, and there were some serious stand-up fights in some places and a couple of very well-known tragedies. Mm-hmm. So the cost was high, not only to the locals, but also to the agents which we infiltrated into France. And of course, ethnically, in places like Yugoslavia and Greece, there were tribal wars were being fought at the same time. Among the agents was, of course, this very famous radio operator called Noor Inayat Khan. She was an Indian princess. She had been a WAF, a radio operator, and the French section sent her in to a failed circuit called the Prosper Circuit in Paris, 1943. She was the only radio operator left in Paris. She was very diligent. She worked like anything, and she was betrayed by a jealous woman. But the Germans knew she was there, and the silly girl kept all her notes. She was incredibly brave. She made 2 escape events, but was eventually taken off and murdered in Dachau. And this is 2013, where Princess Anne unveils the bust of Noor Inayat Khan with a member of the Fanny. You can see her with her Fanny hat on there at the ceremony. It's a very moving tribute. There's another one also on the embankment to the women resistance operators and so on. But this also makes the point that the cost was very high, particularly when security was bad and people did not follow the training and advice that they'd been given.
And Ingram, it seems that, and again, they tended to shoot the men but send women to camp, so to prolong the agony almost. I don't know.
They did, but at the end of the war, the SS and the Gestapo went mad, and they went off killing as many agents as they get hold of. And of the 119 SOE agents deported into Germany, into the camps, only 23 men and 3 women came back.
Gosh.
And that's SOE. SIS had an even higher death toll. It was a really terrible period right at the end of the war.
Yeah. But, you know, it wasn't all doom and gloom. And I think, you know, I don't want people to go away now and kind of think,
all gloom and doom. This is a very famous figure. This is Daphne Park, who was a Fanny cipher instructor. She instructed the Jedburghs at Milton Hall. She later became a conducting officer in Massingham, which is the Algiers base, and eventually joined the SIS. She learned Russian. She served in Moscow, Hanoi, the Congo, and eventually became one of the directors of SIS, and eventually retired with her record clean, and went back to be the principal of her old college, Somerville, in Oxford. And that's her at some ceremony at Somerville. And she was a shining example of what women could do and did during the Second World War. And she is a famous figure. She ended up in the House of Lords, and she was a great advocate of the services and the secret intelligence services and the story of SOE. And she was a great woman. And one time I had the privilege of meeting her as well.
I think it's a lesson to all of us, really, because look at her in her lovely purple hat and her jacket. And again, I think you said to me when you first showed me this photograph that she looks like your favourite aunt. But in fact, you know, if you don't take people at face value and you actually talk to them and learn and understand their story, you know, what a fantastic life she led. You know,
yes, she was quite a girl.
Yeah, yes. Right. So what are the keys to success?
Well, just to round up, really, we've mentioned air transport and parachuting, and the efficient way that this was organised and eventually resourced was completely crucial to the efficiency of SOE. Likewise, the signals organisation, once it got taken over from SIS and put together by Nick Nichols, became safer and critical to the efficient working of the operations on the ground. The invasion of Soviet Russia, of course, as I mentioned, turned the communist world against the fascists.
Yeah.
And the entry of the United States brought massive resources into the game: aircraft, radio equipment, weapons, and so on and so forth. And the OSS, which lived a slightly uncomfortable life wherever it met SOE. SOE was much more experienced in OSS. And of course, Donovan had to keep proving in the United States that it was an American affair and nothing to do with these liners. And he had a very difficult political job balancing that, knowing that actually he depended on the British because of their experience and their methods and some of their people and their training and so on and so forth. He was very successful in the end, and the OSS became the CIA, which we know today. I've also mentioned the STO, forced labor, which meant that the men took to the hills and formed the Maquis, which eventually took on the Germans with a massive campaign of sabotage, ambushes, assassinations, and so on. And lastly, perhaps the tribute to Gubbins, that from an underground organization where people moved anonymously among the occupiers, you get uniformed teams parachuted in to turn the resistance into a military organization. And that's Gubbins' success in organizing SOE.
Was Gubbins there right till the very end?
Yes, he was. He was very
badly
badly treated by the Attlee government. He was pensioned off, but he left a legacy in the Special Forces Club and an insistence that the story of SOE be preserved to some extent and remembered, and in particular its agents.
Okay.
SOE was packed up in January 1946, and some of its duties taken over by SAS.
Right, Ingram, we're really coming to the end of our time, as it were. So we've got a couple of questions, and I'll just leave that slide on there for a moment, and we'll just round off with that in a second. But if I could just quickly ask you, so we've had a question from Alex, and he said, how much of the SOE's classified files from World War II remain secret, and for how many more years are they likely to be out of the reach of researchers?
Well, it's reckoned that because of post-war destruction for security reasons, of SOE documentation, a fire that took place in SOE headquarters, but only about 13% of the documentation that SOE produced has been preserved. And it's preserved in the National Archives under various catalogue headings, HP being the principal one, but you also find papers in the War Office, Cabinet, and other catalogue headings.
Okay.
Q tell me that there are 1,654 personnel files at Q, which, when you consider that the SOE consisted of 10,000 people in the staff and training establishments and 5,000 out in the field, that's a very small percentage. Yeah. And the principle they use is that the file is put in the public domain when the individual is known to have died or when 100 years have lapsed from their date of birth.
Okay.
And generally speaking, the SOE files have always been chaotic, and having done a bit of work on them, I agree with that. And maybe the main restraint on getting information out of them is the ability of researchers to research them, rationalize them, and write them up. But there have been some recent very good studies of SOE operations, like that one, which is, if you can see that,
it's disappeared. SOE, I think it's special SOE in Burma.
SOE in Burma, just written up. So the academics keep going, keep rationalizing them, and you can get some very, very good accounts of SOE operations that way.
Okay, Ingram, and a second question from Lawrence. How often were expeditions, missions, or assignments undertaken solo? Well,
usually when you were conducting sabotage, as we've seen, they parachute in a team, like the grouse team we looked at in the context of Norway. The first agents of SOE were individuals like Virginia Hall, and the first radio operator, who was called Georges Béguet, parachuted in on the 5th of May 1941, was an individual. But the idea was that when they got there, they would form a réseau, a circuit. And they soon learnt that a team of 3, the leader, who was an instructor in weapons and so on, a courier, usually a woman, and a radio operator, a man or a woman, was the ideal team. They wouldn't necessarily live or work together. They would be dispersed for security reasons. But that was the setup that was eventually adopted. Then, of course, you get the uniform teams like the Jedbas,
yeah.
and then you get bigger ones, or delegates. I mean, when Bill Deakin parachuted into Quito, he took with him a bodyguard, an interpreter, a radio operator, an SIS officer who had his own radio operator and his own bodyguard as well. So about 6 or 7 people jumped out of that Halifax.
Right.
And incidentally, that Halifax was flown by New Zealanders, none of whom were older than 21 years old. And in a modern context, that makes you think.
Yeah. Okay, Ingram, I think we have to wind it up now, unfortunately. But before we do, again, let's think back to where we started. You at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, here at Blenheim Palace, and the exhibition that's running there at the moment at your museum. And just mention to me very briefly what these items are that people can come and see. And then we'll say goodnight.
Well, these are 3 murderous weapons for use by agents. The one on the left of the screen is a hat pin, as might be used by a lady to keep off an offensive gentleman, but also has a little thing in the handle there where you can roll up a message, little container, and screw the top back on and carry the message around when you use this to pin your hat on.
Brilliant.
On the right-hand side of the screen are 2 other murder weapons. One is a sleeve knife, which you have up your sleeve, and when you want to assassinate your victim, you slip it out of your sleeve and slip it into his guts. And then you have...
This is my favourite.
This is a lapel knife, which you keep up under your lapel as a gentleman, or possibly as a lady, whip out and stick into your opponent. It's a fairly short thing, so you have to hit him in the right place if you're going to deal him a death blow. These are on display with radios, uniforms, and lots of other SOE type equipment in the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock. And this display is one of the displays in which I had a part to play.
And am I right in saying that it's on until the end of April?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Sure.
Lovely. So people can come along.
Slightly held up because of the
yeah.
So.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, it just remains for me to say, Ingram, thank you so very much. It's been absolutely fascinating. And go and see the exhibition. It's well worth a visit. And you'll see lots more information about what these brave people did to save the country. So, Ingram, good night.
Good night.